Hi, welcome to micro lecture 8.1. We're moving along here. We're coming close to the end of the criminal justice section that covers the courts. So we're going to talk a little bit about the adversarial system today, as kind of an entryway or something to spark your interest and thought. Trial by combat. Trial by combat existed during what most people call the Middle Ages. It is introduced into England at least around 1066. It wasn't called trial by combat in England. It was called wager of battle. So a little bit different. And the idea was that God would defend the innocent party if there was a struggle between the two. And so right would triumph. Well, I use this as kind of the hook because a lot of people watch shows like Game of Thrones and see this and they think, wow, how silly, how barbaric. But I use this as a hook to talk about the adversarial system because how does it relate to our system? I mean, we base our trial system on the idea that two sides compete, the defense and the prosecution, and through that competition, the truth emerges. And if you think about it, that is very similar to the idea of trial by combat or wager of battle, in which we are assuming that truth, much like God, will come out in a conflict between two sides. But doesn't, as in trial by combat, in our adversarial system, doesn't the relative skill and power of each opponent really determine the outcome? If one side has a lot of resources and the other has very few, doesn't that impact things? So we should ask a fundamental question. I don't think, I try to get you to do this in this court, I don't think we ask enough fundamental questions as we examine overall systems. So one of the things I think we should look at is, well, how often do we mess up in our system? What is our percentage of error? How many innocent people go to prison? How many guilty people aren't convicted? Because there's two sides to this. Very often when people talk about the problems with the American criminal justice system, they tend to focus on innocent people in jail, which I admit is a terrible thing. But you also should think about guilty people not being convicted, particularly if you've got people who are committing multiple crimes or have profited from their crimes. The idea that they are not convicted of a crime is pretty serious. So what are some of the core problems that you could say exist in our system? Well, what are the resources available to each side? Is it truly equal? And by the way, this can skew the other way sometimes. This can skew where if you have an extremely wealthy defendant, it could be very difficult to convict him, as opposed when you have a very poor defendant, it's much easier to convict him. Is there really a presumption of guilt or of innocence? How do we use the adversarial system to determine what the facts are versus what the law is? How does a competition between two sides arguing about what the value of pi is, or what's the circumference of the earth, how can that be the way to determine the truth? And is there an emphasis in our system on the form over the substance? So, convicting the innocent is something to look at here. I would have loved to have a slide convicting, quitting the guilty, but it's almost impossible to find those statistics. The number of innocent people convicted of crimes in the United States is somewhere between 2.5% and 5%, we think. Now, if we look at the cases, the capital cases, since 1989, so roughly the last 40 years, there have been 2,000 people convicted of murder that have been exonerated, and that can mean that they were ultimately found innocent, or there was insufficient proof to maintain their guilt. So about 4%, which is right in our range of 2.5% to 5% of all defendants sentenced to death were later proven to be innocent. So what were some of the reasons? Bad science, bad judges, including judges that fell asleep, bad lawyers on each side, bad witnesses, false confessions, prosecutorial misconduct, bad police work, and of course, systemic racism. So I think it's fair to ask, if we're going to be critical of our system, and again, this is trying to get you to think in a wider context, is how do we compare to similar countries? So take another country that is similar to the United States that doesn't have the adversarial system, so France or Germany, and take a look and say, okay, well, how do they do? Well, I will refer you to a couple texts, because this is a pretty deep dive if we were going to win this. Wrongful Convictions, the International Perspectives on Miscarriage of Justice. That's a Temple University Press book. And Wrongful Convictions and Miscarriage of Justice, Causes and Remedies in North America and European Systems. It's a little bit more recent. What we do seem to find is when you compare wrongful conviction rates in countries that have the adversarial system, which are primarily English-speaking countries, but with a few exceptions, it's higher than those that are inquisitorial. And I'll get back to inquisitorial in 1 second. So the inquisitorial system is different than what we use. So how's it different? Well, first of all, there aren't juries. You don't select a jury to determine the truth or to evaluate evidence. Instead, there are judges. Now, usually it's a panel of judges. It's usually 3. Sometimes there's a lay judge that sits with them, and you have to have a majority vote to convict. They also don't usually focus around a single trial. There's usually multiple hearings to determine stuff. Also, there's almost no plea bargaining in this system. And judges actually participate. They inquire, hence inquisitorial, into what the facts are or aren't. Other judges at an earlier stage are actually involved in investigations. So there's usually what are called magisterial or magistrate judges, which work with the prosecution and the police developing the case to make sure that they're behaving. But when it gets to the court, those judges don't do the questioning. So you've separated those two. And the stated primary goal is to search for the truth, not to win, not to lose, and there's no incentive for anybody involved too much to convict. Okay, well, that was very brief, I know. It's just kind of introducing some ideas that I want you to kind of think about and percolate in your mind. And we'll go on to the next lecture whenever you feel like it.